To say no to one of my kind, such an exquisite, fleeting sort of courage. Come in, little ones. You look so terribly pale. We have a tale tonight of a mortal who thought themselves clever, and a sovereign who was terribly amused. Subscribe if you wish to return to my library. I so enjoy making new acquisitions for my collection. I told the vampire queen no. She smiled. In the end, all worlds die. Some go in fire, some in ice, some simply fade, like a photograph left in a weak sun for 10,000 years. The world of Nocturne was fading, and its queen, who remembered the vibrant colors of its birth, was the only one left who truly knew how gray everything had become. The darkness in the great hall of the obsidian spire wasn't just an absence of light. It was a presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket of shadow that had been growing for centuries. Ragged breathing echoed in the void, his breathing. The sound was jarringly alive in the place that had perfected the art of stillness. A single cold blue light stabbed down from the vaulted dark. And there he was, the alien, the anomaly, Caleb, chained to the floor like an animal. He didn't know how long he'd been in the dark. Days, maybe. Long enough for the terror to burn away, leaving only a cold, hard knot of defiance in his gut. He'd lost his ship, his crew, his world. He had nothing left to give them but that. Then, a shape detached itself from a throne of solid darkness. She descended, not walking, but flowing down the obsidian steps. Her armor was the color of a starless midnight, accented with spikes that mimicked the vertebrae of some great predatory beast. A crimson gem set in the center of her breastplate pulsed like a captured heart. She was a thing of impossible, terrifying beauty, a living statue carved from moonlight and malice. She stopped before him, and the very air grew brittle with cold.
"Kneel before your queen."
Her voice was a melody played on bone chimes, a command, not a request. It was laced with the ancient power of compulsion, a force that had leveled armies and humbled gods. It slid into Caleb's mind, a cold silken tendril seeking to wrap around his will and pull him to the floor. Every instinct, every cell screamed at him to obey, to press his forehead to the cold marble and beg for a life he wasn't even sure he wanted. He felt his muscles tense, his spine begin to bow. I have seen kings with the blood of constellations in their veins collapse into weeping puddles at that tone. I have watched conquerors who burned galaxies surrender their swords and their souls. It is a power that unspools the very concept of defiance. But this boy, this scrap of angry, breathing meat from a forgotten star. He thought of the flash of light that had vaporized his home, the screaming over the comms that had gone silent one by one, the cold, lonely dark of the escape pod. He had knelt before the end of his world. He'd be damned if he'd kneel for this one. He locked his jaw, grit his teeth until they ached, and pushed back against the silken pressure in his mind with the only thing he had left, raw, bloody-minded spite. He looked up through a matted curtain of dark hair and met her eyes.
"Go to hell."
The silence in the hall was absolute. 1,000 ancient hearts stopped their slow, methodical beat. The shadows themselves seemed to recoil. The hulking guards behind her, a mountain of black steel and fury, actually took a step forward. But the queen did not move. She simply stared. No one had spoken to her that way in 5,000 years, not and lived to draw another breath. He had just spat in the face of a goddess, And for the first time in millennia, Seraphina felt something other than the crushing weight of her own eternity. She felt intrigued. With a grace that was utterly human, she leaned down. Her armored finger, cool as cryofluid, brushed the cut on his temple. Caleb flinched, not from pain, but from the shocking cold of her touch. She drew a smear of his blood, the crimson shockingly bright against the dark, articulated metal of her gauntlet. She raised it to her lips. To the Nocturne, blood was everything. It was history, power, currency, and sustenance. To Seraphina, whose own blood was the oldest and purest, the blood of her subjects was a thin, tasteless gruel, a necessity, but never a pleasure. When Caleb's blood touched her tongue, it was not gruel. It was fire, a supernova of pure, unadulterated life. It was the taste of a yellow sun, of raging oceans, of rage and grief, and the will of forged iron. It lit up every deadened nerve ending in her ancient body, a jolt of such staggering potency that for a single, terrifying second she felt her own heart, the desiccated, useless organ in her chest, give a single phantom thump. Her eyes widened, the crimson irises flaring. What was this creature? Oh, that boy. One does have to admire the sheer, magnificent stupidity. I haven't seen an entrance that suicidal since the last days of the Solar Imperium. Delicious. He saw the flicker of shock in her eyes, the briefest crack in the porcelain mask, and he grinned, a bloody, feral thing. He gathered the spit and blood in his mouth and spat. The wet smack of it hitting the pristine marble echoed like a gunshot in the tomb-like silence.
You filth!
Victor started forward, his rage a palpable force, but Seraphina didn't even glance at him. She simply raised a hand. He froze, his expression warring between fury and absolute obedience. Her gaze was locked on Caleb, on the defiant glare in his storm-gray eyes. He was broken, chained, and moments from death, yet he looked at her as if she were the one on her knees. This was not a spirit that could be broken with simple pain. This was a puzzle, and Seraphina had grown so very tired of things that were simple. The air in the hall shifted. The shock curdled into something else, opportunity. Lord Valerian, the leader of the upstart, umbral conclave, detached himself from the wall of shadows. He moved with a panther's predatory grace, his modern tunic a deliberate insult to the ancient traditions of her court. Valerian's ambition was a constant, low-grade fever in the body politic of Nocturne. He saw Seraphina's long, stable reign not as a triumph of order, but as stagnation, a slow, managed decline she disguised as peace. He believed their future lay not in preserving their dying world, but in consuming new ones. And in Caleb, he did not see a defiant soul. He saw a key, proof that the larder of the galaxy was stocked.
Your Majesty, 1,000 pardons for the interruption.
His voice was like velvet dipped in acid.
But to allow such vermin to defile your hall seems a waste of its singular energies. Its blood is clearly potent. A rare specimen like this could be an invaluable asset. Perhaps it should be studied, its properties catalogued for the good of the queendom.
Seraphina turned her head slowly, the motion of a predator assessing a threat. She could feel the lingering fire of Caleb's blood on her tongue, a secret warmth in her cold body. Asset, Valerian's word for it. Clinical. He wanted to vivisect Caleb, to drain him, to replicate whatever made his blood a lightning strike to their fading systems. A practical solution, a boring solution. It was a tempting offer. The world was dying, the blood of their thralls growing thinner with every generation. Caleb's vitality could be a stopgap, a way to bolster her power for the desperate ritual she planned. But to simply break him down for parts felt wasteful, like using a masterwork painting to fuel a fire.
The good of the queendom has been my solitary concern for 10 millennia, Lord Valerian. I do not require your counsel on how to secure it.
Her tone was ice, a dismissal so absolute it was a slap. Valerian's smirk tightened, but he gave a courtly, shallow bow.
He will not be studied. He will be tested.
She looked back down at Caleb, who was watching the exchange with a cynical, wary intelligence.
He has a fire I have not seen since the before times. I wish to see how brightly it can burn before it is extinguished. He is sentenced to the blood trials.
A murmur rippled through the shadowed court. The blood trials, a gladiatorial spectacle, a place for condemned criminals and political embarrassments to die for the court's entertainment. To sentence this unique specimen to the arena, it was decadent, it was sentimental. It was, from Valerian's point of view, gloriously, predictably weak.
As you command, my queen. A bold choice. I trust the spectacle will be entertaining.
The subtext was clear. When this gambit fails and this asset is destroyed for your amusement, I will remember it. Serafina ignored him. She looked down at Caleb one last time, her crimson eyes holding his stormy gray ones.
Let us see if your spirit is as strong as your blood, little spark.
She turned, her armor making no sound, and ascended back to her throne of shadow, leaving him in the cold blue light. Victor grabbed Caleb by the chains, hauling him to his feet with brutal strength. As the massive champion dragged him away, Caleb looked back at the throne. The queen was a silhouette against the darkness, a figure of absolute power. But he could have sworn he saw, just for a moment, a flicker of something in the dark. Not cruelty, not anger. Something that looked terribly like loneliness. Then he was being pulled into the crushing black, the sound of his chains dragging on the marble, the only farewell. The Veritas Basin was where hope came to be ritually disemboweled. It was an open-air cathedral consecrated to violence, its walls of weeping black stone rising to a sky perpetually bruised with twilight. A thick, ground-hugging fog coiled around Caleb's ankles, cold and damp. The air smelled of wet sand, old blood, and the bored apathy of the immortal spectators who filled the stands like elegant, pale vultures. He'd been given a piece of sharpened iron that barely qualified as a sword, and a pair of coarse trousers. The message was clear. You are not a warrior. You are meat. In her royal box, draped in crimson velvet that burned like a fresh wound against the grey stone, Serafina watched. She leaned forward, her chin resting on her gloved fingers, a portrait of regal detachment. Behind her, Valerian stood like a patient wolf, his presence a constant, silent critique. She could feel his judgment, his amusement at her whim. A part of her, the ancient, practical part, agreed with him, but another, older part, a part that remembered when the stars were young and bright, was curious. The groan of a rising portcullis echoed across the black sand. The thing that emerged from the shadows was a biological abomination, a nightmare-given flesh. It was 10 feet of mismatched muscle and chitin, with 4 arms ending in jagged bone spurs and a drooling maw that opened like a festering flower. It was a golem, a creature bred for mindless distraction and wars, so ancient their names were lost to dust. It saw Caleb, and it let out a bellow that was the sound of tearing flesh and grinding stone. The crowd stirred, a collective anticipation. The beast charged. It moved with the terrifying speed of an avalanche, its steps shaking the very ground. Caleb didn't try to meet it.
He wasn't a fool. As a soldier, he'd fought things bigger and stronger than him. The key was never to fight their fight. He turned and ran, not in a blind panic, but with purpose. His eyes weren't on a monster at his heels. They were scanning the arena, the crumbling walls, the piles of fallen statuary, the shadowed archways. This wasn't a flat field, it was terrain, and terrain was a weapon. From her vantage, she saw his strategy instantly. The other prisoners, the other condemned, they always died the same way. They stood their ground in some pathetic display of honor, or they ran screaming until they were caught. They accepted the terms of the engagement. The human did not. He was changing the equation. A flicker of something, not quite admiration, but a clinical respect stirred in her. She glanced around the arena at the stands. She noted, as she always did, the empty sections, the seats of noble houses that had withered and died out, their lines thinning to nothing. More empty chairs every century. She looked up at the sky, at the dim, tired light of Nocturne's dying sun. The decay was everywhere, in her people, in her world, in the very air they breathed. It was this slow, creeping entropy that fueled her secret, desperate plan. A ritual so dangerous, so ambitious, it would either save them or shatter their world completely. A plan that required a massive surge of power she did not yet possess. She looked back at the arena, at the human who tasted of starlight, and a dangerous thought took root. What if he is more than just a curiosity? The golem smashed its fists into the sand where Caleb had been a second before, roaring in frustration. Caleb was already scrambling up a heap of broken Gothic architecture, the remnants of some long-forgotten temple. He was fast, agile, using the terrain like a jungle cat. He perched on a narrow, crumbling archway 20 feet up, a ridiculously vulnerable target.
Hey, ugly, up here.
He was baiting it. The creature, a being of pure rage, took the bait without a second thought. It began to claw its way up the pile of rubble, its immense weight sending stones skittering down. Its hunger for the kill overrode any sense of caution. This was what Caleb had counted on. As the beast heaved its bulk onto the archway, Caleb moved. He didn't attack. He jammed his short, pathetic sword deep into a crack between two massive blocks of stone at the arch's foundation. The blade wedged itself in, a small metal fulcrum. The golem lunged. Its full weight hit the already unstable structure. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan of tortured stone, the archway gave way. The sword had been just enough, a tiny point of pressure that broke the system. Tons of rock and masonry crashed down in a dusty, violent cascade. The golem shrieked, a high-pitched sound of agony this time, as two of its powerful limbs were caught and crashed under the avalanche of stone. It was trapped, roaring and flailing, but immobilized. Caleb landed on the sand in a crouch, rolling with the impact. He rose, his bare chest slick with sweat, a long gash bleeding freely down his arm. He was breathing in ragged, desperate gasps. He looked at the screaming, trapped beast. He still had his weapon. He could, by the rules of the trial, deliver the killing blow. The crowd was silent, confused. This was not the clean, brutal slaughter they were used to. It was messy. It was tactical. Caleb didn't move toward the beast. He simply stood there, looked at the ruin he had wrought, and then lifted his gaze to the royal box. He didn't look proud. He didn't look triumphant. He just looked bone-weary. He had survived. Again. In the royal box, Lord Valerian's face was a mask of cold fury. This was not the outcome he had wanted. It was an embarrassment. But Seraphina slowly sat back in her crimson throne. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It was the first genuine expression she had worn in a century. The fire was burning brighter than she could have possibly imagined.
The aftermath of victory was a stone cell that smelled of mildew and despair. They'd patched his arm, a rough, functional job, and thrown him back into the dark. Caleb slid down the cold, weeping stone wall, his muscles screaming in protest. Every breath was a negotiation with his bruised ribs. He closed his eyes, but the image of the screaming, trapped Gulon was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. He hadn't killed it. The thought should have brought him some comfort. It didn't. He just condemned it to a slower, more agonizing death at the hands of its keepers. In this world, mercy was just a different flavor of cruelty. The faint light from the hallway was suddenly eclipsed. A figure stood in the barred doorway, a silhouette of lean, elegant lines against the cold glow. Caleb's eyes snapped open, his muscles tensed, his body preparing for another fight it couldn't win. The figure didn't enter. He simply leaned against the bars, an image of casual, predatory grace. Lord Valerian.
Impressive, truly. Using the environment. A novel approach. The beasts are usually so much more cooperative.
His voice was a silken purr that made the hairs on Caleb's arms stand up. Caleb said nothing. He just watched, breathing slowly, conserving what little energy he had left.
The queen is entertained. She sees a puzzle box, a new toy to distract her from the tedious business of managing a dying kingdom. It's her great weakness, you know, sentimentality.
Valerian tapped a single manicured nail against an iron bar. The sharp tink echoed in the small cell.
She thinks your defiance is a virtue, a sign of strength. I see it for what it is, a suicidal ignorance of the game you're in, but a useful one.
He pushed away from the bars and began to pace, a caged predator outside a cage.
She will keep testing you. She will watch you bleed for her amusement, and when the novelty wears off, or when you finally break, she will discard you. That is the nature of a god with a short attention span.
Get to the point.
Valerian stopped, a flicker of genuine amusement in his steel-colored eyes.
I appreciate that. Very well. The point is this. Her fascination with you is a political liability. It makes her look weak, unfocused. Help me demonstrate that. Help me expose her. Distraction. For the weakness it is.
Help you? Why the hell would I help you?
Because I am offering you something she never will. A way out. Not just from this cell, but from Nocturne. I have resources, ships. I can return you to whatever backwater star you crawled from. All I need from you is to continue to be her glorious, tragic failure. Push her. Make her intervene. Make her show her hand. Make her look like a sentimental fool who values a pet over her people.
The offer hung in the air, glittering and poisonous. Freedom. The word was a physical blow. The thought of seeing a yellow sun again, of breathing air that wasn't tinged with decay, it was a pain sharper than any blade. He could do it. He could play the game, be the pawn, and win the ultimate prize. All he had to do was sell his soul to a different devil. He looked at Valerian's handsome, predatory face, at the smug certainty in his eyes. He thought of the queen, sitting on her throne of shadows, with a loneliness so profound he'd felt it from across a stadium. One monster offered a cage of gilded curiosity. The other offered freedom at the cost of utter betrayal.
Shove it up your ass.
The smile from Valerian's face vanished. The temperature in the cell dropped 10 degrees. The air grew thick, heavy with a menace that was suffocating.
A pity. I would have made your death quick.
He turned,
his movements sharp, precise.
The queen may be entertained, human, but I am not. Her next test for you will be arranged by me, and I assure you, it will be far less survivable.
He paused in the doorway, a black shape against the light.
I will see you torn apart on the sand, and she will watch.
Then he was gone. The cold light returned, seeming even dimmer than before. Caleb let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He'd survived the Queen's test. Now he had to survive the Queen's rival's retribution. He leaned his head back against the damp stone, and for the first time since he'd crashed on this cursed rock, allowed himself a small, bitter laugh.
Valerian was a man of his word. The second trial was not a test. It was an execution disguised as sport. The arena had been transformed into a rain-slicked replica of a ruined city, a maze of collapsing chapels and shadowed alleyways perfect for an ambush. Caleb stood with his team, two terrified, four-eyed Xylans, a disgraced nocturne noble with trembling hands, and a hulking, silent creature whose species he didn't recognize. They were lambs, and across the square the wolves were waiting. 5 of Valerian's personal guard, vampires of a younger, more brutal bloodline, stood clad in matched black armor, their curved swords gleaming even in the dim light. Their arrogance was a physical presence. A single deep bell tolled, and the hunt began. The 5 vampires didn't charge. They melted into the shadows of the ruins, their movements too fast, too fluid.
No, stay together. Back to back. Use the archway as a choke point. Now!
He shoved the shivering noble toward the relative safety of a narrow, crumbling passage. The others, desperate for any kind of leadership, scrambled to follow. But it was too late. A blur of motion in the rain, a hiss of steel. The Xylon on the left made a soft, wet sound, and its head tumbled from its shoulders, hitting the cobblestones with a sickening thud. Crimson blood, impossibly bright, fountained into the gray air, painting a nearby wall in a grotesque parody of a rose.
In her box, Serafina flinched. A sharp, icy sting radiated from her own neck. She instinctively raised her hand to her throat, her brow furrowing. It was nothing. An echo, a sympathetic resonance from the bond. But it was stronger than before. More distinct. Beside her, Valerian's lips curved into a subtle, satisfied smile. His champions were efficient. This would be over quickly. Caleb didn't hesitate. He didn't mourn. He reacted. With a roar of pure rage, he launched himself at the vampire who had just struck. He was slower, weaker, but he had the advantage of surprise and the physics of a body that weighed 200 pounds. He slammed into the immortal, his shoulder connecting with a force that would have broken a human collarbone. The vampire, caught off balance, staggered back, and Caleb drove him into a stone wall. They went down in a tangle of limbs in the mud and rain. The vampire was all grace and speed, its fangs snapping inches from Caleb's face. But Caleb fought dirty. He was all elbows and knees and brute force, his human desperation a weapon the immortal didn't understand. He got his hands on either side of the vampire's head and began systematically smashing it against the wet cobblestones. The first hit stunned it. The second cracked the skull with a sound like ice breaking. The third was a wet crunch, and the vampire went limp. One down, but another was already there, sword raised for a killing blow. A shadow of death falling over him. Then a grunt and a spray of dark vampire blood. The disgraced noble, his face a mask of terror and newfound courage, had driven his crude spear through the second champion's side. He had followed Caleb's lead. He had chosen to fight. A spark of hope. It was extinguished immediately. A third champion's blade, elegant and cruel, sang through the air. It bit deep into Caleb's side. The pain was a blinding, white-hot flesh. It stole his breath, his strength,
his vision. He cried out, a raw animal sound of agony, and fell back, his hand clamping over the wound as his own hot blood gushed between his fingers. The world dissolved into a swirling gray tunnel. "Ugh!" In the royal box, Seraphina gasped, doubling over as if she'd been gutted. A searing, incandescent pain exploded in her left side. So real, so profound, it stole the air from her lungs. This was not a phantom echo. This was shared agony. Her vision swam. She clutched at her own armored side, feeling the phantom wetness of blood, the phantom tear of muscle. Valerian glanced at her, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in triumphant understanding. He had seen it. He knew.
Your Majesty, are you unwell?
The concern in his voice was pure poison. She couldn't answer. She was fighting for breath, fighting the alien agony that was flooding her senses. On the arena floor, through a haze of pain, Caleb saw the last two champions cornering the terrified noble and the other alien. They were toying with them, savoring the kill. Something inside him snapped. It wasn't thought. It wasn't strategy. It was pure, primal instinct. The instinct of a protector. With a roar that was more beast than man, he surged to his feet, ignoring the fire in his side. He charged. He didn't use a weapon. He used himself. He slammed into the two vampires with the force of a runaway train, his arms wrapping around them. The three of them tumbled, a chaotic mass of bodies, over the edge of a ruined parapet and disappeared into the darkness of a flooded cellar below. A huge splash echoed up into the rain. Then, silence. The trial was over. The noble was alive, and Caleb was gone. They had pulled him from the flooded cellar, more dead than alive. The two champions he had taken with him were broken things, their immortal bodies shattered by the impact. He, a fragile mortal, should have been pulp, but he was breathing, faintly, stubbornly. They brought him to the Medicae ward, a cold, sterile chamber where the Queen's physicians performed their quiet, blood-based miracles. They staunched the bleeding, but the wound was too severe, the tearing of muscle and organ too catastrophic. They left him on a stone slab to die. Seraphina came alone. The phantom pain in her side had receded to a dull, persistent throb, a constant reminder of the impossible connection. She told herself it was a matter of state. This human was a political crisis, a catalyst she didn't understand, and his inexplicable survival demanded investigation. She told herself it was logic. She told herself it was duty. She lied. She glided through the silent, vaulted chamber, a wraith in black velvet, her bare feet making no sound on the cold stone. She stopped beside his slab. In sleep, or whatever state of near death this was, he looked younger. The hard lines of defiance on his face were softened, replaced by an exhaustion that seemed soul deep. The scar through his eyebrow was a pale white line against his skin. She could see the faint, steady pulse in his throat, a fragile, mortal rhythm. Thump, 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 thump. A sound she hadn't felt in her own chest for 10,000 years. She felt the echo of the ache in her side, a mirror of the wound hidden beneath the crude bandage on his. An impulse, illogical and overwhelming, seized her. She needed to see it, to understand the conduit of their shared pain. I will say this for love, darlings. It has a magnificent way of making even the most ancient and powerful beings do monumentally stupid things. Curiosity, she called it. We all have our little euphemisms for the abyss, don't we? She reached out a hand, her long, pale fingers trembling slightly. Just a touch, a clinical observation. She was a queen, a goddess. Her body was a vessel of pure, ancient power.
His was a fragile shell of flesh and blood. What harm could there be in a simple touch? Her cool fingertips made contact with the blood-soaked bandage over his wound. The world exploded in gold. It was not the cold, blue-silver light of nocturne blood magic. It was warm, brilliant, and utterly alive. A visible arc of raw golden energy leapt from her skin to his, a bridge of pure life force. The air crackled, the bandage sizzled and turned to ash. Beneath it, the gaping, mortal wound began to hiss and bubble. Torn muscle writhed, knitting itself together. Skin stretched and sealed with terrifying speed. It was not healing. It was creation. Her ancient, stagnant life force, awakened by his potent blood, was pouring into him, a dam breaking. Caleb's body arched off the slab with a strangled cry, his back bowing as the alien energy flooded him. His eyes flew open, wide with anguish and shock that went beyond the physical, and they were locked on hers. Serafina snatched her hand back as she'd been plunged into a furnace. She stared, her composure utterly shattered, at her own glowing fingertips, then at Caleb's heaving chest. Horror, stark and cold, washed over her. The whispers of the bond, the phantom pains, that was one thing. A curiosity. This was a physical manifestation, an undeniable, terrifying circuit between them. Her power, her life, had just answered the call of his wound without her consent. The sovereign's claim. A myth, a legend whispered in hushed tones from a time before time. A bond so profound it was said to only form when a monarch's very soul found its missing half. A contamination, a heresy. They stared at each other across a few feet of crackling air. He was breathing hard, his eyes wide with a horrified understanding. She was frozen, her mind, which held the history of a civilization, utterly blank with terror. In his eyes, he saw not just a prisoner, but a man. In hers, he saw not a queen, but a woman terrified of the power she could not control. The bond was real, and it was a secret that could no longer be kept. The bond once manifested was a relentless presence. It was a long, constant hum beneath the silence of her ancient existence. A new string on an instrument she thought she had mastered millennia ago. Serafina retreated to the cold solitude of her chambers, but there was no solitude anymore. He was there, a ghost in her senses. She stood before her scrying basin, the black water a perfect mirror of the starless void outside her window. With a thought, she commanded it to show him. The surface shimmered, and the image of his cell coalesced. He was on his feet, pacing the cramped space, his movements agitated, feral. The wound in his side, it was healed. A puckered, angry scar of new flesh was all that remained of an injury that should have killed him. Her power had done that. Her life force, siphoned against her will. He was a part of her now, whether she wanted it or not. As she watched him, he stopped pacing and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. And then it hit her, a memory. Not hers. A flash of sensory data so alien, so overwhelming, it buckled her knees. The painful, glorious glare of a yellow sun, so bright it made her eyes water. The feeling of hot, coarse sand under bare feet. The salty smell of a vast ocean. And the sound of laughter, a woman's laugh, free and unburdened. The raw, unfiltered joy of it was an agony. It was a memory of a place called the beach. A day with a family now turned to dust and echoes. It was his. She stumbled back from the basin, her hand flying to her temple as she fought the psychic intrusion. She, Serafina, who had built walls of ice and ritual around her mind for 10,000 years,
had been invaded by the trivial, beautiful memory of a dead mortal. The warmth of it, the simple, uncomplicated happiness, was more terrifying than any weapon. It was a poison to the cold, ordered world she had built for herself. She looked at her own hands, at the pale, perfect skin. They felt alien. She was a queen, a goddess. She was not meant to feel the ghost of sunshine on her skin. She was not meant to ache with the loss of a family she had never known. The bond wasn't just a connection. It was a contamination, and it was spreading. And as she was haunted by his past, he was burdened with hers. In the long, dark hours in his cell, Caleb's sleep was no longer his own. He didn't dream of Earth, of the war, of his loss. He dreamed of her. He felt the crushing, monolithic weight of 10,000 years of rule, the endless silent processions through stone halls, the faces of courtiers blurring into a meaningless parade of masks over the centuries. He tasted the ashes of loneliness on his tongue, a solitude so profound, so absolute, it was a physical state of being. He woke up not with hatred for his captor, but with a terrible, infuriating pity. He was beginning to understand the monster, and that was more dangerous than any trial. The Elder Council chamber was a tomb for a dying government. 20 thrones for the 20 great houses, but tonight only 6 were occupied. The ancient vampires who sat upon them were like dried husks, relics of a glory long faded. The empty chairs were Valerian's greatest allies. They screamed of failure, of decay, of the ineffectual, stagnant rule he laid at Seraphina's feet. He stood in the center of the room, a vital, dangerous presence in a museum of the near dead. He spoke of the thinning blood, the failing thrall populations, the weakening sun. He painted a picture of their race sliding into oblivion, all while their queen obsessed over a curious pet. He was weaving a narrative, and the empty thrones were his proof.
Traditions have kept us safe for millennia, Lord Valerian. The Queen's judgment has never failed us.
Valerian turned to the old vampire with a look of profound pity.
Safe? My Lord Cozell, with all due respect, your house has not produced a new fledgling in 500 years. Look around you. We are not safe. We are fading. Tradition is a beautiful shroud for a corpse. Our Queen's judgment, this fixation, is a symptom of the disease.
Seraphina's hands gripped the obsidian arms of her throne, her knuckles white. He was using her bond, the connection she couldn't control, as a weapon against her. He was twisting her intrigue into dereliction of duty.
She spills our resources, risks our political standing for the amusement of watching a lesser being bleed in the sand. She has grown sentimental, and sentiment in a monarch is treason against the future.
That is enough.
The air in the chamber grew ice-cold. Her eyes began to glow, the crimson deepening to the color of arterial blood. For a moment, the true, terrifying power of the 10,000-year-old queen was on full display. Valerian didn't even flinch. He smiled. He had provoked her. He had made her emotional. In the eyes of the council, he had proved his point. He dropped to one knee, a perfect, mocking picture of fealty.
Forgive me, Majesty. My passion for our people's survival makes me bold. But since my counsel is so easily dismissed, let us turn to a higher authority, ancient right.
The air went still, an ancient right. The words were a death knell.
I invoke the right of judgment. Let the human face a final trial. Let us settle the question of his significance once and for all. Not against a beast, but against the very measure of the throne's power. Your champion, Victor.
A collective gasp went through the council. Victor, standing like a statue by the door, went rigid. It was the ultimate political gambit. A duel
by proxy. Victor was not just a guard, he was an extension of Seraphina's will, a living symbol of her physical might.
If the human falls, as he surely must, then his anomaly is purged, and the queen's distraction is ended. But if the human wins, if this mortal pet is able to defeat the right hand of the Eterna dynasty, then it proves the champion is weak. It proves the queen's judgment is flawed. It proves her strength is failing. It proves we need a new path.
He stood, his arms wide, a savior offering a terrible, logical salvation. Seraphina was trapped, the rite was binding, its invocation before the council absolute. To refuse was to publicly admit her strength was a sham. To accept was to sentence Caleb to certain death at the hand of her most loyal, most brutal servant, or worse. So much worse. To stake her entire reign, the stability of her world, on the impossible chance that he could survive. She looked at Valerian's triumphant face, and for the first time in her eternal life, Queen Seraphina felt the cold, hard steel of a political trap closing around her throat. She had no choice.
So be it. The right is accepted.
This was not a trial, it was an ordeal. The arena was lit by fire, great roaring braziers that threw dancing monstrous shadows across the black sand. Caleb stood opposite a legend, Victor, the Queen's champion. 1,000 years of loyal, brutal service made manifest in a mountain of black steel and scarred flesh. He wielded an axe that seemed forged from a fallen star, and his flat gray eyes held nothing but the promise of a swift, merciless end. He was the Queen's will made flesh, and Caleb had to break him.
For the Queen.
He charged. It was not a run, it was an earthquake. The great axe whistled, a sound of pure annihilation. Caleb dove, rolling across the sand as the axe had buried itself a foot deep in the spot where he'd been standing. The ground shuddered. This was not a fight he could win with strength. What followed was a dance of desperation. Victor was a landslide, each swing of his axe a cataclysmic event. Caleb was a leaf in the wind. He didn't block, he didn't parry, he simply wasn't there. He used every ounce of his human agility, his soldiers' training in asymmetrical combat, to evade, to survive. He let Victor's own unstoppable momentum become his enemy, forcing the huge vampire to overcommit, to leave infinitesimal openings. It was exhausting, punishing work. The near misses alone were enough to bruise bone.
In her box, Seraphina was no longer a queen. She was a raw, exposed nerve. She stood gripping the stone balustrade, her knuckles white. The ancient pact of non-interference she held with the arena was a torment. She was watching her own hand try to murder her own heart. The bond was a screaming torment, feeding her Caleb's pain, his exhaustion, the burn in his lungs, and feeding him something else.
Caleb slid under a swing that would have cut him in half. As he came up, he felt it. Not a thought, not a voice, a feeling, a wave of pure, undiluted, terrified hope flooding him from the direction of the royal box. It was the most powerful thing he had ever felt. It was her, stripped of all her power and pride, praying to gods she didn't believe in for his survival. The dream memories of her loneliness, her burden, clicked into place. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the woman trapped inside the queen. Fueled by that impossible connection, he moved. As Victor recovered from his swing, Caleb's gladius, a pitiful thing of iron, lashed out and sliced through the thick muscle behind Victor's knee.
Victor roared, a sound of pure shock and agony. He faltered, his perfect footwork destroyed. He had not felt pain in combat in centuries. The sight of his own dark blood welling from the wound drove him into a frenzy. His swings became wilder, sloppier. He abandoned technique for pure, blind fury. This was the opening Caleb had been waiting for. Victor raised the axe for one final, all-or-nothing, horizontal swing meant to cleave Caleb's head from his shoulders. Caleb dropped. The wind of the axe whistled over his head. He sprang up, inside the champion's guard, too close for the axe to matter. He was a small, mortal man pressed against a demigod of war. Victor's eyes widened in surprise. For a split second, they were face to face, and in that second, Caleb drove his sword up under the pauldron, finding the one small gap in the master-crafted armor, and plunged it deep into the flesh beneath. The air left Victor's lungs in a wet, strangled gasp. His eyes fixed on Caleb's were not filled with hate, but with a profound cosmic surprise. The great axe slipped from his fingers and thudded onto the sand. He stumbled back, one hand going to the hilt of the sword buried in his shoulder. Caleb wrenched the blade free with a wet shriek of steel. With the last of his strength, he kicked the back of Victor's wounded knee. The champion of 1,000 years, the symbol of the Queen's undying strength, fell. He did not fall like a warrior. He collapsed, crashing to the black sand with a final, ignominious clang of steel on stone. He was defeated. Caleb stood over him, chest heaving, blood dripping from a dozen minor cuts. He raised his sword. The firelight danced on the blade. The arena, for the first time, was utterly silent. The silence of the arena was a living thing, a held breath of 1,000 immortals. Then the bloodlust returned. It started as a murmur, a whisper. Kill. It grew, a rising tide of ancient predatory instinct. Kill, kill, kill. The word became a drumbeat, a singular, unified demand from a race that understood only one resolution to conflict, the spilling of blood. In his box, Lord Valerian was incandescent with triumph. He had won. If the human killed Victor, he had proven the Queen's champion, and by extension the Queen, was weak and fallible. If he refused, he would be cut down for insubordination, and the Queen's pet would be removed from the board. Either path led to his ascendancy. He had checkmated a goddess. Seraphina stood frozen, her heart, the metaphorical, bonded one, a frantic bird in her chest. She watched Caleb raise the sword. She saw the firelight glint on its bloodied edge. This was the moment, the culmination of everything. He looked down at Victor, at the loyal servant who had followed her command, even when it meant fighting a battle she did not want him to win. Then Caleb looked up. His gaze swept past the howling mob, past Valerian's gloating smirk, and found her. His eyes, the color of a coming storm, locked with hers, and in that gaze, across the expanse of sand and shadow, the bond flared into a silent, screaming conversation. He saw her, not the Queen, but the lonely woman from his dreams, trapped by her crown, and she saw him, not a gladiator, not a pawn, but a man with a moral compass so unshakable it could navigate the abyss. Power, darlings, is not the ability to kill. Any brute can do that. True power is the earning of that right, looking God and death in the eye, and choosing to walk away. And in that moment, in the beautiful, deafening silence that was about to fall, a 10,000-year-old queen learned that lesson from a mortal boy with nothing left to lose. With a quiet grace that belied the brutality of the last hour, Caleb lowered his arm. He turned the sword in his hand, holding it by the blade, and he let it drop. The clang of steel on stone was a thunderclap in the sudden, absolute silence. The chant died in 1,000 throats. The word kill was left hanging,
orphaned in the dead air. Every single vampire in the stadium stared, their ancient minds unable to process what they had just witnessed. An act of mercy? No, it was not mercy. It was something else, something they had no word for. An act of defiance louder than any shout, a rejection of their entire philosophy. Valerian's smile broke. It didn't fade, it shattered, his face twisting into a mask of disbelief and rage. This was not a move on the board. This was a man flipping the entire game table over. This was a power he could not comprehend, and therefore could not control. Serafina rose slowly from her throne. The sound of her own breathing was loud in her ears. He had won. He held the power of life and death over her most powerful servant, a right earned in blood, and he had simply given it back. In that single, silent gesture, he had demonstrated a strength so profound it made her millennia of dominance look like the petty squabbling of a child. He had not broken her champion, he had broken her definition of power. Caleb's gaze was still locked on hers. He was breathing hard, swaying on his feet, but his voice, when it came, was steady. It wasn't a shout. It was a statement, and every soul in the arena heard it.
I'm not your monster.
He then did what no one expected. He turned his back on the defeated champion, on the silent crowd, on the furious lord, and faced his queen. It was an act of ultimate trust, or ultimate folly. He stood there, wounded and unarmed, and waited for her judgment. The power was no longer in his hands, it was back in hers, and what she did next would redefine her reign. In the aftermath, her authority was absolute. Valerian's challenge had crumbled to dust. By refusing to kill, Caleb had handed Serafina a victory more total than any execution could have. She pardoned him publicly, her voice ringing with a newfound power that had nothing to do with compulsion. She elevated him from prisoner to something else. Advisor, curiosity, confidant. The court did not understand, but they obeyed. Later, on a high balcony overlooking the sleeping city, the silence between them was a balm. The wind was cold, carrying the scent of dust and distance. She had ruled from this spire for ages, but the city had never looked so real.
You have reminded me of a strength I had long forgotten, Caleb. The strength of restraint.
He looked at her. The moonlight, thin and silver, softened the severe lines of her face. The goddess was gone. In her place was a woman who carried the weight of a dying world on her shoulders. A woman who was profoundly, terrifyingly alone. He reached out and took her hand. His was warm, solid, scarred, a mortal hand. Hers was cool, smooth as polished stone, and felt impossibly fragile in his grasp. The moment their skin touched, it began. A warmth bloomed from the point of contact. He felt a tingling on his wrist and looked down. An intricate pattern was etching itself onto his skin, burning not with heat, but with a soft golden light. A complex sigil of interlocking rings and stellar alignments, glowing like an ember under his flesh. He looked at her and saw the same horror and wonder on her face. The same mark was appearing on her wrist, a perfect, glowing twin of his own. Serafina stared at the sigil branding their joined hands. She knew it. From the most ancient texts, from myths so old she herself had dismissed them as fairy tales. The sovereign's claim was one thing. This was another. This was the mark of the twin souls, a bond from a prophecy that did not speak of saviors or salvation.
No!
It was not a prophecy of a new dawn. It was the prophecy that foretold the final night, the mark that heralded the Enev Kol, the twilight of the gods, the end of the vampire race. Their impossible bond wasn't a miracle meant to save her world. It was the trigger for its utter destruction. Oh, the sound of a paradigm shattering. Poor Caleb thinking his defiance was an act of mercy. So gloriously naive. And just when Queen Seraphina believes she has found salvation, prophecy brands her with the sigil of her people's own doom. It is always the hope that poisons the soul, my darlings. These particular tragedies are spun exclusively for Crimson Tales. If you wish to watch a queen's world unravel, subscribe. I will be waiting to show you precisely how deep the darkness goes.